When first-class passengers mocked a group of sweaty railroad workers as just diggers, one man quietly stood up. He stepped off the train, sat in the dirt beside them, and changed how a nation saw dignity. No one knew that simple lunch would spark a movement and make history. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The train sliced through the Kansas plains like a silver ribbon, its reflection glinting beneath a relentless summer Sunday. The landscape stretched endlessly on both sides, fields of dry grass rippling in the hot wind, and far in the distance, a few lonely barns standing against the horizon. Inside the first-class cabin, the air was cool and crisp, filled with the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. A faint scent of roasted coffee and expensive perfume lingered. It was a world sealed off from the dust and sweat outside. Keanu Reeves sat quietly near the window, wearing a faded gray shirt and dark jeans. His hair pulled back in a low tie. He was returning from a charity event in Denver, one that had raised money for children's hospitals. Though many recognized him, few dared approach. His calm presence drew attention without demanding it. He often traveled alone, preferring the stillness of the train to the constant flash of cameras that came with his fame. The rhythm of the train's wheels beat a steady pattern beneath his feet. He looked out through the wide window, eyes tracing the motion of the rails that shimmered under the heat. And that's when he saw them. A group of men worked just a few yards from the tracks. Their bright orange vests were stained with dust. Their faces were flushed red under the midday glare. They swung hammers, adjusted heavy bolts, and wiped sweat from their brows with old handkerchiefs. One of them, older with a white beard, stood up to stretch, his shirt soaked through. Another, younger and leaner, knelt beside a rail, tightening a connection with both hands blistered. They spoke little, moving in rhythm, bound by routine and exhaustion. Inside the train, an entirely different rhythm filled the air. Soft jazz from a speaker, the rustle of luxury magazines, the laughter of those who had never held a tool in their life. A teenage boy across the aisle leaned toward the window and snickered. "Look at those diggers," he said loudly enough for the whole section to hear. "Bet they haven't showered in a week." A few passengers chuckled. A woman in pearls fanned herself, smirking. "Hard work is one thing," she muttered, "but you'd think they could at least keep tidy." Laughter spread through the cabin, casual and cruel. Keanu's eyes stayed fixed on the window. The sound of laughter seemed to fade as he watched one of the men stumble slightly, catching his balance on a rail. A surge of heat, not from the sun, but from something deep inside him, rose in his chest. He had been that man once. Not a worker on the rails, but a young man fighting to make rent, sleeping in a rundown motel with one flickering lamp, scraping by on movie set jobs and motorcycle repairs. The memory was sharp and vivid. He could still recall the sting of being dismissed, the feeling of invisibility. And now, he was surrounded by people who looked at others as if their worth could be measured by the dirt on their hands. The conductor's voice broke through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be stopping for approximately 20 minutes due to scheduled track maintenance. Please remain seated until further notice." Passengers sighed. One man in a business suit groaned about missing his lunch reservation. Another woman whispered about switching to a private jet next time. But Keanu stayed silent, his gaze locked on the group outside, his hand resting on the window pane as the train began to slow. As the cars rolled to a stop, the heat from the ground shimmered upward, distorting the air. The workers took shade under a makeshift tent, pulling out their packed lunches, simple sandwiches, a thermos, maybe a few apples. They laughed among themselves, unaware that inside the train, they had been reduced to a joke. Keanu leaned back in his seat, his jaw tightening. The boy who had mocked them was still giggling, recording a video through the window. His mother didn't stop him. Keanu took a deep breath. His reflection in the window looked tired, older, but his eyes carried something steady and clear. He looked back out toward the men, their sweat, their silence, their strength, and something within him shifted. He reached for his backpack. The attendant, walking past him, paused. "Mr. Reeves, we'll be stopped for a while. Would you like anything from the lounge?" Keanu looked up slowly. "No, thank you." He zipped up the small pack, slung it over his shoulder, and stood. Around him, conversations faltered as people noticed. Some recognized him instantly. A whisper spread through the car. "Is that Keanu Reeves? What's he doing?" He gave a small nod to the attendant, walked down the narrow aisle, and stepped toward the door leading to the platform. The airlock hissed softly as he pressed the release. The door slid open, letting in a wave of heat and the scent of hot iron and dust. Outside, the world looked harsher, brighter, more real. He stepped down slowly, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The workers turned their heads, surprised to see a man in clean clothes walking toward them from the gleaming train. The passengers inside leaned against the windows, their phones already out, curiosity buzzing like electricity. They expected him to make a speech, take a photo, or wave politely before returning to comfort. Instead, Keanu kept walking quiet, deliberate, each step taking him further from luxury and closer to the truth of what he'd seen. The workers watched him approach, puzzled but cautious. The foreman, a broad-shouldered man with a sunburned neck and weary eyes, called out, "You lost, buddy?" Keanu stopped a few feet away, his expression calm. He looked at the group, their lunches laid out on the sand, their hands still trembling from work. Then, with a faint smile, he said the words that would change everything. "Mind if I join you for lunch?" The men glanced at each other, unsure if they'd heard right. One of them laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. Another shrugged. But Keanu wasn't joking. He lowered himself to the ground, sat cross-legged beside them, and opened his backpack. The scene stunned everyone on the train. The silence hung for a moment before one of the younger workers, a lean man with dust streaked across his face, finally spoke. "You sure about that?" he asked, half smiling in disbelief. Keanu nodded, his voice steady. "I'm sure. It's been a long ride. Thought I'd enjoy some company with real people for a change." The men chuckled awkwardly. One reached into his lunchbox and offered half of a sandwich. "It's just peanut butter," he said shyly. Keanu accepted it without hesitation. "Perfect," he replied, taking a small bite. The workers relaxed, realizing he wasn't here to prove a point or make a scene. From the train, faces pressed against the glass, recording on their phones. The passengers couldn't believe what they were seeing. A world-famous movie star sitting in the dirt with men whose names they'd never know. Keanu didn't notice. He was listening to the rhythm of their talk stories about long shifts, broken tools, and missed dinners. The sun beat down harder, glinting off the rails, and the laughter from the workers mixed with the hum of the train's idle engine. Inside that heat and dust, something small and profound began a moment that no camera could truly capture. One of the older workers, his hands rough and scarred, looked at Keanu curiously. "You ain't like most folks who come off that train," he said. "They look at us like we're part of the ground." Keanu smiled faintly. "My mom used to say people who keep the world running don't often get thanked, but they should." The man's expression softened. Another worker laughed, shaking his head. "Didn't think I'd ever eat lunch next to a Hollywood fella." Keanu shrugged. "I'm just a guy eating a sandwich. No different than you." The honesty in his tone made them all fall silent for a moment. A breeze kicked up, lifting bits of dust across the rails. The hum of cicadas filled the space between them. From the window above, the teenage boy who had mocked them earlier lowered his phone, suddenly unsure what to think. Inside the train, murmurs replaced laughter. People watched quietly now, some with guilt, others with awe. Keanu finished his sandwich and took a sip from his water bottle, his gaze still on the men. He knew he'd remember this more than any award show or premiere, and though no one realized it yet, the world was already watching. The train lingered longer than expected at the maintenance stop, the air inside turning restless. The rhythm of idle luxury broke apart into murmurs and sighs. A businessman in a navy suit checked his watch for the third time, his gold cufflinks flashing under the cabin light. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Every minute we sit here costs me money." His words carried easily in the confined space. Across from him, a woman in designer sunglasses dabbed her forehead with a silk napkin. "Do we really have to stop here, of all places?" she said with an exasperated laugh. "I don't want to spend lunch staring at filthy workers. Can't they fix tracks at night like normal people?" Her voice was sharp, confident, used to being agreed with. Several passengers chuckled softly, the kind of polite laughter that follows cruelty, disguised as casual talk. The teenage boy from before was still filming, his phone pressed to the window. "Look at them," he whispered to his mother. "They look like they've been living in the dirt." Keanu sat still, listening. The words rolled around the cabin, each one carrying the same unspoken assumption that comfort made someone worth more. He didn't flinch outwardly, but something in his expression shifted. His eyes, calm and distant, reflected the glare of the noon light outside, where the workers toiled under a sun that had no mercy. The train's gentle hum contrasted sharply with the clang of metal from outside. Through the glass, Keanu could see the crew gathered under a rusted awning. Their shirts clung to their backs, soaked through from the heat. One man poured water from a dented thermos into his hands and wiped his face. Another shared a sandwich with his co-worker, splitting it clean down the middle. Keanu leaned closer to the window, studying them. He recognized the look in their eyes, the same quiet focus, the same exhaustion, the same endurance that once filled his own reflection. He thought of his early days in Hollywood, long before fame or comfort. There had been a time when his life fit inside a single duffel bag. He remembered the smell of oil and sweat from working part-time at a mechanic shop between auditions. The cheap motels with flickering neon lights. The ramen dinners that stretched across 3 nights. The way people looked at him then, not cruelly, but dismissively, like he was invisible. Now, as he sat among polished shoes and crisp linen suits, he felt the weight of that memory press against him. The train car, once a symbol of luxury, felt suddenly small. He turned away from the window and gazed down the aisle. The passengers had returned to their distractions, scrolling phones, gossip, idle complaints. No one looked outside. No one seemed to care that a dozen men were out there sweating so they could glide smoothly toward their next destination. Keanu's jaw tightened. In that moment, the divide between the two worlds, the polished and the gritty, the admired and the overlooked, felt impossibly wide, but he knew it didn't have to be. He glanced once more at the workers, then at his reflection in the glass. It was time to make a choice. Outside, the sun beat down with relentless force. Heat waves shimmered off the metal rails, bending the air like a mirage. The workers gathered beneath a weathered metal shelter that looked barely strong enough to stand another storm. They unpacked their lunches, sandwiches, wrapped in wax paper, a few thermoses of coffee, maybe an apple or two. The scene was simple, humble, but full of quiet life. Keanu's eyes followed one of them, a younger man with short, dark hair and a patchy beard. He looked no older than 30, yet his shoulders carried years of labor. He laughed as an older co-worker told a joke, his voice echoing faintly through the open window. Despite the exhaustion, there was warmth among them, a kind of brotherhood that money couldn't buy. Inside the cabin, the contrast was unbearable. The air conditioner hummed softly, keeping everyone comfortable, while a waiter rolled a cart down the aisle with iced drinks and pastries. The businessman raised his hand. "Sparkling water, please, and make sure it's cold this time," he snapped. The attendant nodded quickly, adjusting his tie. Keanu didn't move. His hands rested on his knees, still and thoughtful. He felt an ache that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the ache of distance between those who worked and those who watched, between sweat and comfort, between gratitude and entitlement. A woman across the aisle leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Imagine having to live like that. Out there in the heat all day, no air conditioning, no privacy." Her husband shrugged, not unkindly but without understanding. "Someone's got to do it," he said before returning to his laptop. Keanu's gaze dropped to the floor. The rhythmic vibration of the train under his feet reminded him that it was those same men outside who made every smooth ride possible. They were the ones who laid the tracks, fixed the bolts, risked their lives for people who never even looked them in the eye. He thought of a quote his mother once told him when he was young and struggling. "Don't forget to look down when you climb. The hands that built the ladder deserve your respect." He'd carried those words through every success, every loss, every quiet moment of gratitude. The conductor's voice crackled through the intercom again, cheerful but weary. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be here another 15 minutes. Thank you for your patience." More groans followed. 15 minutes? The businessman repeated, rolling his eyes. "Unbelievable." Keanu stood. The motion was slow but deliberate, enough to make the people near him glance up. He looked out one last time at the men sitting in the dirt, eating their lunches under the shade of that rusted roof. A faint smile tugged at his lips. He reached down for his backpack. The moment his fingers touched the strap, something inside him settled a calm resolve, the kind that comes when a person knows exactly what they must do next. He rose from his seat, the murmurs of the train car fading behind him. Keanu stepped into the narrow aisle, the floor gently rocking beneath his feet as the train idled. Conversations dimmed as passengers noticed him moving toward the exit. A few whispered his name, unsure why the famous actor was suddenly on his feet. The attendant looked startled when Keanu approached. "Mr. Reeves, is everything all right? We'll be leaving shortly." Keanu gave a polite nod. "Everything's fine. I just need some air." The attendant hesitated. "Outside, sir? It's very hot and the ground isn't clean." "I'll be fine," Keanu interrupted. Softly, his tone kind but firm. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and stepped toward the end of the car. The airlock door hissed open, letting in the blast of heat, dust, and sunlight. As he stepped down the small metal stairs, the contrast hit him. The sound, the smell, the rawness of real life, outside the bubble of polished comfort. The workers noticed him almost immediately. A few squinted, unsure of what they were seeing. One man nudged another and said quietly, "Is that who I think it is?" Their laughter died down as curiosity took over. Meanwhile, inside the train, passengers leaned toward the windows. Some held their phones up, recording. The businessman from earlier chuckled. "Well, this should be good. Maybe he's filming something." The woman beside him adjusted her sunglasses, muttering, "Probably wants a photo op." Keanu paid none of it any attention. He walked steadily toward the rusted shelter, the gravel crunching beneath his boots, the wind carrying the metallic scent of the rails. The workers watched him approach, still, unsure. When he reached them, the younger man with the patchy beard, the same one Keanu had noticed earlier, set down his sandwich and stood up. "You lost, mister?" he asked, half amused. Keanu smiled faintly, shaking his head. "No. Just figured I'd stretch my legs. Mind if I sit here with you guys for a bit?" The men exchanged looks, some grinning in disbelief. The foreman, a tall man with a sunburned neck and hands like stone, gave a short laugh. "You want to sit here? In the dirt? You know there's a nice air-conditioned car right over there." Keanu's smile didn't fade. "Yeah, I know, but I think I've had enough air conditioning for one lifetime." The men chuckled, still unsure what to make of him. Finally, the foreman shrugged. "Suit yourself." Keanu sat down cross-legged beside them, resting his bag on the ground. A few of the men nodded in greeting. Someone passed him a paper, cup of water, and he took it gratefully. From the window, the passengers inside fell silent. For the first time, the mocking laughter was gone. All that remained was quiet disbelief as they watched a man who could have stayed comfortable choose to sit in the dust with those they had dismissed. The workers began talking again, slowly at first, then freely. Keanu listened more than he spoke, his eyes kind and attentive. Back on the train, a teenage boy lowered his phone, suddenly unsure whether to keep recording. He looked up at his mother and whispered, "Mom, he's just sitting with them." She didn't reply. She was watching too, her expression softer now, her reflection caught against the glass. And as the sun burned over the Kansas plains, the divide between privilege and labor began to shrink not through speeches or headlines, but through a single quiet act of respect. The group of railroad workers froze when they saw Keanu walking closer. His calm steps crunched softly on the gravel, and for a moment, no one said a word. The air hung thick with dust and heat. It wasn't every day that a man who looked like he belonged on a movie screen crossed the tracks to sit in the dirt. The foreman, Hank Morales, wiped sweat from his brow and squinted. He was in his 50s, broad-shouldered, with hands hardened by decades of work. His voice carried the sharp edge of caution. "You lost, sir?" Keanu shook his head lightly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "No, I just thought I'd join you for lunch, if that's all right." The men exchanged puzzled glances. Hank barked a laugh, thinking it was some kind of joke. "Join us? Out here?" He pointed at the dirt, his grin half disbelieving. "You know there's air conditioning over there, right?" Keanu lowered himself to the ground without hesitation, settling cross-legged in the sand beside them. "This spot seems just fine," he said simply. The laughter faded. The men looked at him, this stranger who seemed both familiar and out of place. Luis, the youngest of the crew, maybe 23, shifted uncomfortably. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his shirt was torn near the shoulder. After a moment, he hesitated, then unwrapped his paper lunch. I don't have much," he said softly, tearing his sandwich in half. "But you can have some, if you want." Keanu accepted it with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his tone sincere. He took a small bite and nodded. "It's good." Luis smiled nervously, his shoulders relaxing. "It's just ham and cheese," he muttered. "That's my favorite kind," Keanu replied, his voice quiet but warm. The men began to chuckle again, not at him this time, but with him. A few of them opened their own lunches, the air around them easing into something more human, more familiar. Hank finally sat down, across from Keanu, crossing his arms. "You sure you're not here for some documentary or movie thing?" Keanu shook his head. "Just passing through. Saw you guys working in this heat. Figured I'd sit down for a bit." The older man studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough." The group began to eat again, the awkwardness fading. A soft rhythm of conversation returned about the temperature, the train schedule, the rough week they'd had. Keanu listened intently, asking gentle questions. His calm curiosity disarmed them, his humility unexpected. The breeze carried the smell of oil and warm metal. A few feet away, a worker reached for his phone and quietly snapped a picture, unable to resist capturing the surreal image. One of Hollywood's most recognizable faces, sitting in the dust among men the world barely noticed. Hank leaned back on his elbows, studying the man beside him. "You don't seem the type to hop off a first-class train just to eat with a bunch of sweaty guys," he said with a half-smile. "What's the story, mister?" Keanu took another small bite of the sandwich and looked out toward the long stretch of tracks. "No story," he said softly. "Just wanted a break from the noise. It's quieter out here." Hank chuckled. "You call this quiet? Between the hammering and the engines, it's a symphony of chaos." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, but it's an honest sound." That line caught the men off guard. A few of them looked at each other, not sure what to say. One of them, Gus, the oldest on the crew with graying hair and sunburned cheeks, gave a slow grin. "Haven't heard anyone call it that before. Most folks just call it noise." Keanu smiled back. "Then most folks haven't been listening." The men laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes when someone says something that feels true. Luis, who had been quiet again, finally spoke. "You're Keanu Reeves, right?" His voice carried a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Keanu shrugged gently. "That's what they tell me." Luis's eyes widened. "So, it is you. My mom loves your movies, man. She used to play Speed all the time when I was a kid. Said it was her favorite." Keanu laughed lightly. "That's a good one," he said. "A long time ago, but I remember the heat on that set too. Nothing like what you're dealing with, though." Hank chuckled, shaking his head. "You know, we thought you were crazy walking out here. But now you're just… what's the word? He paused, squinting as he searched for it. Normal. Too normal for someone famous. I'm just a person, Keanu said simply. And you're people doing something that matters. Seems like we're all in the same business, keeping things moving. Gus smiled at that. Never thought of it that way, but yeah. Somebody's got to make sure these trains run straight. The men's tone had changed completely. Suspicion had turned into respect, and respect slowly gave way to warmth. The more they spoke, the less they noticed the heat. Keanu listened as Hank talked about his 3 decades on the job, how he'd started as a replacement for his father, who'd laid tracks before him. Luis spoke of working summers to help his mother with rent, dreaming of going back to school one day. Gus told stories about derailments, storms, and the pride that came from building something people depended on but rarely thought about. Keanu didn't interrupt. He nodded occasionally, his eyes steady and sincere, taking in every word. From the train, passengers continued to stare. None of them could hear what was being said. But they could see that something was happening, something they didn't understand. The group's laughter blended with the wind as Keanu leaned back against a wooden beam, letting the warmth of the sun press against his face. It was an ordinary moment, made extraordinary by where it happened and who shared it. Luis finished his sandwich and pulled a small photo from his pocket. A faded picture of a little girl with braids and a missing front tooth. That's my sister, Sophia, he said proudly. She's turning 8 next week. Wants to be a doctor. Keanu smiled. She's got a good role model. Luis shook his head, embarrassed. Nah, I just swing hammers. She's the smart one. Keanu looked at him with quiet conviction. You build the track she'll ride on one day. Don't sell yourself short. The words lingered in the air. Even Hank nodded slowly, feeling the truth of it. The sound of cicadas filled the silence that followed, steady and peaceful. A few feet away, Gus reached for his phone again and, without saying a word, took another photo. The image was candid Keanu Reeves, sitting cross-legged on the ground with 5 men in orange vests, all of them mid-laughter, the rails stretching endlessly behind them. It wasn't a publicity shot. It was real, unposed, human. Hank noticed and grinned. You'll break the internet with that picture, Keanu chuckled softly. Let's hope not. I'd rather just remember it like this. But the moment was already bigger than anyone there realized. Inside the train, a few passengers were still recording through the glass, their expressions no longer mocking but contemplative. The teenage boy, who had once laughed at the workers, now lowered his phone, ashamed. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered something he would never forget. That's what respect looks like. Back outside, the men began clearing their lunch scraps. Keanu helped without hesitation, gathering wrappers, brushing sand from the ground. Hank watched him with growing admiration. You really don't mind getting dirty, huh? He asked. Keanu smiled faintly. I think I've been dirty most of my life, he said with a hint of humor. But dirt from honest work? That's different. The men laughed again, and for the first time, Keanu wasn't an outsider. He was part of the crew, if only for that short pause in the day. When the distant whistle of the train signaled departure, Keanu rose slowly, brushing the dust from his jeans. Looks like it's time for me to go, he said. Luis stood too, still holding the half-empty water bottle he'd shared earlier. Hey, thanks for sitting with us, he said quietly. Nobody ever does that. Keanu met his gaze. Thanks for letting me. The engine roared back to life, the rails humming again beneath the heat. As Keanu walked toward the platform, he glanced back once more at the men waving from their shelter. He raised a hand in return, his face calm, his eyes reflecting gratitude. And though neither he nor they could know it yet, that simple meal on the sand was about to echo far beyond that dusty stretch of track. The sound of the train idling in the distance faded into the hum of the prairie wind. The workers lingered in the shade, legs stretched out, hats tilted back to block the sunday. What started as an awkward meal had turned into something warmer, a gathering built on shared silence and quiet respect. Hank Morales took a sip from his thermos, the metal cool against his calloused hand. Been doing this 30 years, he said finally, breaking the stillness. My dad used to tell me, the railroad's a beast, son. Feed it right, and it keeps the world running. Forget it, and it'll chew you up. He wasn't wrong. He let out a dry laugh. Missed birthdays, anniversaries, everything. My wife says the tracks raised our kids more than I did. Keanu listened without interrupting. His elbows rested on his knees, his focus steady. That's a long time, he said softly. You must have seen everything. Too much, Hank replied. Had a guy named Carl, best worker I ever had. We were repairing a signal line last summer. One loose cable, one bad step, and his voice trailed off. The others fell quiet. He didn't make it, Hank finished. We buried him 2 days later. No cameras, no headlines. Just another day for the railroad. Keanu nodded slowly, his expression somber. I'm sorry, he said. Hank waved it off, though his eyes stayed distant. Comes with the job. We all know the risks. Gus, the oldest in the group, spoke up next. Carl had a daughter, bright kid, wants to be a teacher, but with tuition these days, I don't think she'll make it. I've been sending her a few bucks every month, just so she knows someone's rooting for her. Luis looked up from his sandwich. My dad used to work this same line, he said quietly. He died when I was 15, heat stroke. The words came out small, almost ashamed. Mom still can't walk past a train without crying. Keanu turned his head toward him. He must have been a good man. Luis nodded. He was. I started working summers here to help out. Guess I never really left. For a moment, the only sound was the soft rustle of wind through the dry grass. Keanu glanced down at their hands, cracked, scarred, marked by years of effort. He didn't see laborers. He saw builders, protectors, providers. He leaned forward slightly. Do people ever thank you? Hank gave a short, almost bitter laugh. Thank us? Not really. Most folks don't even look at us. We're just the orange vests that make them late to work. Keanu's eyes softened. Without you, he said quietly, no train moves. No city connects. You make it possible for people to get where they need to go. That deserves respect. Hank met his gaze and, for the first time, didn't look away. Hank let out a slow exhale, his voice carrying a quiet weight. Respect's nice, but it doesn't pay the bills, he said. Still, it feels good to hear it. Most people just want us out of their way. Keanu nodded thoughtfully. I get that. The world moves fast, and sometimes the ones keeping get together go unseen. Luis picked up a pebble and tossed it toward the rails, watching it bounce off the metal. Guess that's life, huh? Some people build the tracks, some people ride the train. He said it half jokingly, but his tone carried something deeper. Keanu smiled faintly. Sometimes it's the same person, he said. You build something that others use, and in a way, that keeps you moving too. The words sank in slowly. Even Gus looked up with quiet curiosity. You talk different, he said, like someone who's been through a few things himself. Keanu chuckled softly. Maybe I have. I've known what it's like to start with nothing, to be overlooked. He paused, his voice gentle but honest. I used to fix bikes when I couldn't get acting work. Slept in motels that smelled like cigarettes and dust. There were days I wondered if it was worth it. Hank studied him, surprised. Can't imagine that now. You're in movies, right? You made it. Keanu shrugged. I made it somewhere, sure, but it doesn't erase where I came from. Gus nodded, understanding. That's the thing, isn't it? Folks think once you make it, you forget. But you don't. Keanu met his eyes. No, you don't. Luis leaned forward, curious. So what made you keep going? When it got tough? Keanu smiled faintly, looking toward the horizon. I think I just kept believing that every small job mattered. Every act of effort, every honest hour adds up to something good, even if no one notices right away. The men nodded quietly. They understood that kind of faith, the kind built not from comfort, but from endurance. Hank rubbed his palms together, the sound rough like sandpaper. You know, most people don't think much about who lays the rails or who patches the bolts. They just complain when the train's 5 minutes late. But we still show up. Rain, snow, whatever it takes. Keanu's tone softened. That's what makes it noble. Noble, Hank repeated, almost laughing. Haven't heard that word used for us before. Well, Keanu said, maybe it should be. The air grew still again. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a pause filled with unspoken understanding. Men from different worlds finding a shared truth in the heat of an ordinary afternoon. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of the train's horn from far down the line. The crew would soon have to go back to work. Yet none of them seemed ready to stand. The moment felt too rare, too real, to break just yet. The conversation softened into something almost reflective. The men had eaten, shared stories, and now sat quietly with Keanu as the shadows began to stretch across the dirt. The air felt lighter, though the weight of what they had said lingered between them. Hank reached for his gloves, turning them over in his hands. You know, he said, sometimes I think about quitting. My back's not what it used to be. My kids keep telling me to retire. But every time I think about walking away, I remember my old man's words. If you love what you build, you never really leave it. Keanu looked at him, thoughtful. Sounds like your father was a good teacher. Yeah, Hank said with a small smile. Tough as nails, but he taught me right. Luis added quietly. My dad said something similar once. He told me the tracks we fix might carry someone to a better life. I didn't understand it then, but now. He shrugged. Maybe he was right. Keanu nodded. He was. Gus leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You really believe people like us matter, huh? I don't just believe it, Keanu said softly. I know it. You hold up the foundation that everyone else walks on. People forget that because they only see the top floors. Luis smiled, his eyes bright. You talk like you've been down here a while. Keanu looked down at his hands and laughed gently, long enough to remember how it feels. The group fell silent again, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. A freight train thundered past in the distance, its horn echoing across the plains. The vibration trembled through the ground beneath them, shaking the air. All of them turned to watch it streak across the horizon, cars full of cargo, hundreds of tons of steel gliding smoothly because of their labor. When the sound faded, Keanu said quietly, that train moves because of you, because of your hands. Hank rubbed the back of his neck, clearly moved but trying to hide it. We just do our jobs. Exactly, Keanu said. And that's what makes it powerful. You keep things going when no one's watching. For the first time, none of the men looked down. They looked proud. The distant whistle signaled that the passenger train was almost ready to depart. Keanu stood slowly, brushing the dust from his jeans. Guess I should head back, he said. Thank you for letting me sit with you. Hank reached out his hand, rough and strong. Anytime, friend. Keanu shook it firmly, then turned to Luis. Keep helping your mom, he said gently. Your dad would be proud. Luis swallowed hard and nodded. I think he would too. As Keanu walked back toward the platform, Gus raised his phone once more. The camera clicked just as Keanu lifted a hand in goodbye. The picture captured the truth of that moment. One man who saw worth where others saw dirt, and a group of workers who for once felt seen. Inside the train, the mood had shifted from idle chatter to restless curiosity. The first-class passengers who had moments earlier laughed at the workers outside now crowded near the wide glass windows. Their air-conditioned comfort made the world outside look like another planet. Through the glare of the afternoon sun, they watched Keanu, sitting cross-legged in the dirt, surrounded by men in orange vests, sharing sandwiches and laughter. A businessman with slick-back hair leaned toward another passenger and smirked. What's he doing out there? Filming some kind of charity stunt? A woman holding a glass of champagne chuckled. Maybe he's researching a new role. What's next? The Hobo Diaries? Laughter rippled through the small crowd. Several people raised their phones, snapping pictures and short clips. The glow of their screens reflected on the windows like floating sparks of judgment. Has to be for publicity, someone muttered. Nobody does that for real. But not everyone joined in. Emily Carter, a young mother sitting near the back of the car with her 6-year-old son, frowned at the tone around her. She had noticed Keanu earlier, quiet, polite, the kind of man who smiled with sincerity when the conductor spoke to him. Now, watching him outside under the harsh sun, she felt a different kind of respect. When the businessman laughed again, Emily turned toward him. "Maybe he's just being human," she said calmly. The laughter died down for a moment. The businessman blinked, unsure how to respond. "Excuse me?" Emily nodded toward the window. He saw people working hard in this heat and decided to sit with them. "Doesn't look like a performance to me." Her tone was even not confrontational, but it silenced the small crowd. A few passengers turned back to their seats, embarrassed. Others tried to laugh it off, but the sound felt hollow now. Her son tugged at her sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, "is that the man from the Matrix?" Emily smiled softly. "Yes, honey. And right now, he's showing everyone what kindness really looks like." She pulled out her phone, not to record a spectacle, but to capture something genuine. Through her lens, she framed the image Keanu laughing with Hank Morales, Luis, and the crew. No filters, no edits. Just real people sharing a moment that none of them would forget. When she lowered her phone, she didn't post the photo. She simply looked at it and whispered, "That's what humanity should look like." It was honest and warm, rising above the hum of the idling train. Inside, silence fell heavier than before, broken only by the quiet tap of wheels turning slowly on metal. For the first time that day, many of the passengers didn't know where to look. The sunlight outside deepened to a warm gold as the afternoon wore on. The crew of workers had finished their short meal, and laughter echoed faintly through the open air. Hank leaned back against a beam, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd be sharing a sandwich with a movie star," he said. "This'll give the boys something to talk about for years." Keanu grinned. "I think it's me who'll be talking about it for years." They laughed again, and even the quiet Luis couldn't help but smile. The air around them no longer carried the heaviness of work or heat. It felt lighter, alive with simple human connection. From inside the train, however, the tone was far less kind. The businessman from earlier now stood by the door with a group of passengers gathered around him. "This is unbelievable," he scoffed. "He's going to make headlines out of this. You'll see. Probably call it lunch with the working class. It's a stunt, trust me." Another man in a polo shirt nodded. "Public figures do that all the time. My wife met one last year who volunteered for an hour just to get photographed." Their laughter returned, cruel and knowing. Emily, still seated with her son, finally spoke again, her patience worn thin. "You all sound like you've never seen kindness before," she said quietly. "Maybe that's the real problem." A few eyes turned toward her, some irritated, others ashamed. Her son, oblivious to the tension, leaned close to the glass. "He looks happy, Mom." Emily followed his gaze. "He is, sweetheart. Sometimes doing the right thing makes you happier than anything money can buy." Her words weren't loud, but they settled in the air like truth no one wanted to argue with. Meanwhile, near the end of the train, the attendant was pacing nervously. He checked his watch, then his radio. "Mr. Reeves shouldn't be out there this long," he muttered. "What if someone gets a picture that looks bad?" The conductor tried to calm him. "He's fine." He said he just wanted to stretch his legs. "Stretch his legs?" The attendant shook his head. "He's sitting in the dirt with track workers. You don't just do that." The conductor smiled faintly. "Maybe he does." Outside, Keanu's laughter carried across the tracks again. The men were swapping stories, now old jokes from years of hard labor, near misses, and rough mornings. Hank had just finished telling one about a raccoon that once stole a worker's lunch, and even Keanu was laughing so hard he wiped tears from his eyes. For all the passengers inside, that sight meant confusion. But for the men outside, it meant something else entirely. For the first time in years, they felt seen, not as shadows along the rails, but as men whose work and lives mattered. And Keanu, unaware of the cameras pointed at him through the windows, looked perfectly at peace. The sun had begun to tilt toward evening, painting the tracks with streaks of amber and bronze. Keanu stayed seated with the men, his elbows resting on his knees as the conversation drifted between laughter and reflection. There was no rush, no schedule, no pretense. Just people being people. Down the line, a dust trail appeared. A car pulling into the lot beside the station. The door opened, and a woman stepped out, her pace brisk and worried. It was Keanu's assistant Rachel, who had been traveling separately to handle logistics for his next event in Wichita. She froze when she saw him sitting in the dirt, surrounded by men in safety vests, holding a sandwich and grinning like a child. "Keanu?" she called out, half whisper, half shout. "What are you doing?" The men turned toward her, surprised. Keanu looked up, shielding his eyes from the sundae. "Hey, Rachel, you found me." Rachel glanced around, clearly torn between amusement and panic. "I thought something happened. The conductor said you got off the train." He smiled gently. "Nothing happened. I'm just having lunch with friends." "Friends," she repeated, glancing at the group. "You mean the workers?" Hank chuckled. "That'd be us," he said proudly. Luis grinned and offered Rachel a water bottle, which she politely declined, still trying to process what she was seeing. Rachel looked at Keanu again, lowering her voice. "You realize everyone in first class is watching you right now? They're filming." Keanu shrugged. "Let 'em." He looked back at the crew. "They've been working out here in this heat all day. The least I can do is sit down and listen." Rachel hesitated, then exhaled. "You really are impossible." Keanu grinned. "You say that like it's a bad thing." She couldn't help but laugh, shaking her head. "I give up." Back inside the train, Emily still watched quietly, her son now sitting on her lap. The boy pressed his hand against the glass, his voice soft. "Mom, why are people making fun of him?" Emily answered, after a pause. "Because kindness makes some people uncomfortable, but it shouldn't." Outside, Keanu stood, brushing dust from his jeans. The workers followed his lead, preparing to get back to their tasks. Hank extended his hand again. "You're all right, Mr. Reeves. Not many would do what you did today." Keanu shook his hand firmly. "It was an honor. You guys are the heartbeat of this country." As he turned to leave, Luis called after him. "Hey, Keanu. Thanks for eating with us." Keanu smiled, nodding once. "Anytime." He and Rachel walked back toward the train, the last light of the day stretching long shadows across the rails. Behind them, the workers watched silently until he disappeared through the car door. Inside, the passengers avoided eye contact. The same people who had laughed now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing what they had witnessed wasn't a stunt, it was character. Emily whispered to her son, "Remember this moment." And outside, under the fading sun, the laughter of the workers echoed, carrying far beyond the rails, marking the end of an ordinary day that had suddenly become unforgettable. The whistle blew sharply, echoing down the tracks as the train prepared to move again. Keanu and Rachel stepped back inside, the cool air brushing against their sun-warmed faces. Conversation in the first-class cabin halted the moment he entered. Dozens of eyes turned toward him. Some passengers tried to look casual, but the flicker of guilt in their glances gave them away. Keanu gave a polite nod and returned to his seat near the window. Rachel followed, still shaking her head with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "You do realize half the car filmed you, right?" she whispered. He smiled faintly. "That's their business. Mine was lunch." When the train began to move, the passengers slowly resumed their chatter, though now it carried a nervous edge. Whispers drifted through the cabin. "Did you get the video? Send it to me. He's actually a nice guy, huh? Or maybe it's a publicity stunt." Phones glowed in hands, screens lighting up with captured moments of Keanu sitting on the ground, surrounded by workers. One photo stood out. Emily's. Though she hadn't posted it yet, another passenger sitting behind her had caught nearly the same shot and uploaded it within minutes. By the time the train reached the next city, the image was already spreading across the internet. On social media, the caption read, Keanu Reeves spotted eating with railroad workers in Kansas, no entourage, no cameras. Within hours, it exploded across every platform. Comments poured in by the thousands. This man is pure class. He's what every celebrity should be. There's humility, and then there's Keanu Reeves. Hashtags began trending before nightfall. Number Keanu with workers. Number respect the rails. Number human before Hollywood. Inside the train, passengers realized what had happened. Emily checked her phone and gasped softly as the picture flooded her feed. She hadn't shared her own copy, but she smiled quietly, knowing the world was seeing what she had seen. Her son leaned over and whispered, "Mom, that's your photo." She smiled, brushing his hair. "Not mine, sweetheart. It belongs to everyone now." Rachel glanced at Keanu, who was sitting peacefully, watching the landscape roll by. "You've gone viral again," she murmured. He looked away from the window for the first time. "That tends to happen when I do something ordinary," he said, amused. Then, after a moment, he added softly, "Funny how kindness shocks people more than cruelty." The rhythm of the train filled the pause that followed. Outside, the sun sank low over the horizon, glowing orange against the fields. Keanu leaned his head against the window, closing his eyes. He didn't look at his phone once. By the time night fell, his quiet lunch had become a story the world couldn't stop talking about. By evening, the image had made its way to every major news site. Headlines appeared one after another. Keanu Reeves shares lunch with railroad workers. Hollywood's humblest star does it again. One simple gesture captures a nation's heart. Television anchors replayed the same picture, analyzing it as though it were a political event. Some praised the humility. Others questioned the motive. But the truth was simpler than anyone could write. At a small house on the outskirts of Topeka, Luis scrolled through his phone between bites of dinner. His mother, Rosa, stood by the stove, drying her hands with a towel. "What are you smiling at, Mio?" she asked. Luis turned the screen toward her. "Mom, look, it's me. I'm right there beside him." Rosa squinted, then gasped. "Dios mío, that's you. That's Keanu Reeves." Her voice trembled with disbelief. "The whole country's talking about this." Luis laughed nervously. "Yeah, I didn't even know someone took a picture." His mother sat down at the kitchen table, pressing her hand to her heart. "He saw you, Luis. He saw you like your father used to be hardworking, kind. He saw your father's spirit in you." Her eyes filled with tears. "Your father would have been proud of this." Luis swallowed hard, unable to speak for a moment. "He didn't treat us like we were beneath him, Mom. He just listened." Rosa nodded. "That's what good men do. They listen." Meanwhile, Hank Morales received a flood of calls and messages from friends who had seen the story online. "You lucky fool," one text read. "You just had lunch with America's favorite actor." Another joked, "You better frame that sandwich wrapper. It's worth gold now." Hank chuckled, shaking his head. "He's just a man," he muttered to himself. But later that night, as he sat on his porch, he opened the viral photo on his phone again. The glow of the screen lit his weathered face. He studied the image, Keanu sitting there in the dirt beside them, smiling like he belonged, and felt something stir in his chest. Pride, maybe. Or maybe it was gratitude that, for once, someone had seen the value of their work. Elsewhere, on a late-night talk show in Los Angeles, the host held up the photo to the studio audience. "Look at this. Keanu Reeves just chilling with railroad workers. I mean, who does that?" The audience erupted in applause. The host smiled and added, "You gotta love this guy. He's proof that being famous doesn't mean forgetting where you came from." The applause grew louder, the picture glowing on screens across the world. But Keanu wasn't watching. His phone sat silent on the nightstand of a quiet hotel room, turned off hours ago. He was reading a book by the lamp, unaware that a moment of simple kindness had become a national headline. By the next morning, the story had reached international headlines. News outlets from London to Tokyo replayed the same image. Keanu Reeves, sitting in the dirt, laughing with railroad workers. The photo had crossed borders and languages, carrying one clear message: humility still mattered. Rachel woke early to find her phone vibrating endlessly with calls from reporters, producers, and studio representatives. She groaned, scrolling through the flood of notifications. "You're trending worldwide," she told Keanu when he walked into the hotel lobby, coffee cup in hand. He looked surprised but calm. "For what?" She tilted her screen toward him. "For being decent." Keanu chuckled softly. "That shouldn't be news." Rachel smiled. And yet, here we are. As they sat down to breakfast, she read headlines aloud while shaking her head. The internet's favorite gentleman strikes again. Keanu's unexpected lesson in dignity. They're calling it the lunch that stopped America. Keanu took a sip of coffee, looking out the window. "It's funny how people can turn a moment of silence and dust into a spectacle." Rachel leaned forward. "You don't sound happy about it." "I'm glad people are talking about the workers," he said quietly. "Not so sure they're listening to what matters." Back in Kansas, Hank, Gus, and Luis arrived at the rail yard to find a local news crew waiting. The reporter smiled wide. "You're the crew from the viral photo, right? How does it feel to have lunch with one of the most famous men in the world?" Hank crossed his arms, unimpressed by the cameras. "He didn't act famous. He just sat down like one of us." Luis nodded. "He didn't talk about himself once. Just asked about our families, our work." The reporter smiled, pushing the microphone closer. "So was it staged?" Hank's face hardened. "No, ma'am. It was as real as the sweat on our backs." The camera captured his words. And later that night, that clip aired alongside the viral image. Millions of viewers watched as Hank Morales, sunburned and proud, said, "He didn't do it for show. He did it because it was right." Across America, that sentiment resonated. People shared the story not just because of Keanu's name, but because it reminded them of decency, the kind the world often forgot. Later that night, Luis scrolled through comments online. One stood out. "My dad was a railway worker. Seeing this made me cry. Thank you, Mr. Reeves." He smiled, closing his phone. "Guess people finally saw us, Dad," he whispered. Meanwhile, Keanu sat on his hotel balcony, the wind cool against his face. He still hadn't checked his phone. He didn't need to. Somewhere out there, the men he'd shared lunch with were being seen and respected for the first time. And that, to him, was enough. By sunrise, the story had taken over every major news outlet in the country. Television screens glowed in diners, barbershops, and living rooms from coast to coast. The same image flashed again and again, Keanu Reeves sitting cross-legged in the dirt beside a group of dusty railroad workers. Morning anchors debated its meaning, each with a different take. On one network, a cheerful host said, "It's the kind of thing you just don't see anymore. A celebrity sitting with the working class. No cameras, no glamour, just humanity." But on another, a skeptical analyst countered, "Let's not be naive. Maybe this was a publicity stunt. Actors need relevance. He knows what he's doing." The split echoed across the country. Social media feeds filled with arguments, some praising the act as genuine compassion, others dismissing it as performative kindness. One post read, "Keanu Reeves didn't need to say a word to remind the world what respect looks like." Another sneered, "He's selling humility now. How convenient." By midday, late-night talk shows had joined in. One host, known for his sarcasm, joked, "Guess he traded the red carpet for rail dust." "What's next? Keanu Reeves installs your dishwasher?" The audience laughed, but not everyone found it funny. While critics and commentators bickered, something deeper was happening offline. Across factories, construction sites, and shipping yards, workers watched that same image with pride swelling in their chests. Many saw themselves in the men beside Keanu. Truckers posted it on forums. Miners shared it on private Facebook groups. Mechanics taped printouts above their tool benches. The Railroad Union's national page posted the photo with a caption that cut through all the noise. "He saw us." Within hours, that post became the most shared in their history. Beneath it, comments poured in, thousands of them from people who rarely felt acknowledged. A lineman from Ohio wrote, "No one ever sits with us." He did. A janitor in Nevada commented, "Finally, someone reminded the world that dirty hands don't mean a dirty heart." Meanwhile, in Kansas, Hank Morales' phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters called from morning until night. "Mr. Morales," one said, "can you tell us what he said? Did you know who he was?" Hank chuckled, his voice gravelly from years of shouting over machinery. "We knew, sure. But out there, he wasn't a star. He was just a man having lunch." "Did he seem like he was doing it for attention?" another reporter pressed. Hank paused before answering. "No, he didn't talk down to us. He talked with us. There's a difference." That line spread faster than the photo itself. It appeared in quotes, headlines, and memes, repeated by ordinary Americans who felt seen in Hank's words. And while the world talked louder by the hour, Keanu said nothing at all. Keanu's silence became its own message. While reporters speculated and journalists sent endless interview requests, he went on with his life, quietly. There were no press statements, no tweets, no explanations. He simply carried on filming, donating, and reading scripts like nothing unusual had happened. The lack of response only deepened public fascination. People began saying, he doesn't need to defend himself. His actions already said everything. Meanwhile, Hank and Luis were getting their first taste of unexpected fame. When they arrived at the job site that week, they found a small crowd of reporters waiting near the fence. The foreman's truck was surrounded by microphones before he could even park. "Hank, over here!" "Can you tell us what really happened?" one shouted. "Is it true Keanu bought you all lunch?" another asked. Hank laughed, pulling off his gloves. "No, he didn't buy anything. He just shared what we had." Luis, standing nearby, was nervous, but trying to hide it. A young reporter approached him directly. "Luis, your picture is everywhere. What does it feel like to be part of this?" He rubbed the back of his neck, uncertain. "Feels strange, honestly. We didn't think anyone would care. It was just a meal, but it meant something." "What did it mean?" the reporter pressed. Luis hesitated, then said, "It meant someone saw us for who we are. Not for what we wear or how dirty we get, but for being people who work hard. That's all." His answer went viral again that evening. Across the country, talk shows shifted their tone. The same host who had mocked Keanu days earlier played the clip of Luis speaking, then turned serious. "Maybe we got it wrong," he said. "Maybe it wasn't about fame at all." In break rooms and cafeterias across America, workers nodded quietly as they watched. They knew the truth instinctively. It wasn't about a movie star. It was about dignity. By midweek, the story had evolved beyond the viral photo. Articles appeared titled, "What Keanu Reeves Reminded Us About Respect and the Power of Sitting Down." Editorials debated how something so small could ripple across the nation. The railroad union announced that their membership had risen dramatically in a matter of days. Workers who had long felt forgotten suddenly felt part of something larger. The union president released a statement. "For years, people have looked past us. One man's simple act reminded everyone that the people who build the tracks are just as human as those who ride them." Hank read that quote during lunch break and smiled faintly. "He didn't give us attention," he told Luis. "He gave us back our pride." Luis nodded, looking at the dusty rails stretching into the horizon, and he never said a word to the cameras. That's why it hit so hard. Keanu's silence had become louder than any interview could have been. By the end of the week, the noise surrounding the story reached a fever pitch. Analysts, influencers, and talk show hosts dissected every detail of the viral photo as if it were a political event. Some debated whether Keanu's gesture exposed Hollywood hypocrisy. Others called it the most inspiring moment of the year. Yet through it all, the man at the center of it remained silent, choosing humility over spotlight. Rachel, his assistant, fielded constant calls from producers and journalists. "They're offering exclusive interviews, primetime specials," she said, scrolling through her tablet. "Everyone wants your take." Keanu looked up from the book he was reading and smiled calmly. "There's nothing to take. It wasn't about me. Rachel sighed. You know how the media works. If you don't speak, they'll make their own version. He nodded. Let them. Truth doesn't need defending. While he stayed quiet, Hank and Louise became small-town celebrities overnight. The mayor invited them to a community luncheon to honor local workers who remind us what pride in labor looks like. The newspaper ran a front-page story featuring the photo again with the headline, From the Rails to the World. At the gathering, reporters gathered around Hank as he stood in his neatly pressed work shirt, still not used to attention. When asked what made Keanu different, he thought for a long moment before answering. He didn't treat us like a cause. He didn't come to fix us or preach to us. He just came to sit down, eat, and listen. That's rare these days. His words resonated far beyond that small town hall. Within 24 hours, news outlets quoted him verbatim. Ordinary Americans shared clips of his speech with captions like, "This is what respect sounds like." Back at the rail yard, the crew felt a quiet sense of pride. They joked about their newfound fame, but beneath the laughter was gratitude. For the first time, their names were known not because of a mistake or an accident, but because they'd been treated with dignity. Luis's mother, Rosa, watched her son's interview replay on TV, tears filling her eyes again. "Your father would have loved this," she whispered. "He always said someone would notice your heart." Luis smiled shyly. Maybe it took someone like him to make people look. Across the country, the story began to fade from the headlines, but its echo remained. The photos still hung on bulletin boards and break room walls. People who had never cared about the railroad now looked at passing workers with newfound respect. Keanu never commented, never posted, never explained. His silence became part of the story itself. To the public, it said more than any interview could have. That humility needs no announcement, and that true decency doesn't demand to be seen. The world had shouted. He had listened. And because of that, millions remembered a lesson that had almost been forgotten, that sometimes the smallest gestures can move the heaviest trains. A week passed, and the noise of the headlines began to fade. The internet moved on to the next story. But something about that afternoon on the tracks stayed with Keanu. He kept thinking about Hank, Luis, and the others, their laughter, their stories, and their tired hands holding simple lunches under the open sky. It wasn't the fame that stayed with him. It was the honesty. So one quiet morning, before sunrise, Keanu rented a small pickup truck and loaded it himself with boxes. Inside were sandwiches wrapped in brown paper, bottles of cold lemonade, and a few toolkits he'd bought at a local supply store. There were no cameras, no assistants, and no press release. Just one man driving back toward the same stretch of railway that had changed something in him. By mid-morning, the familiar hum of machinery filled the air. The crew was back to work, their boots crunching on the gravel, their voices raised above the wind. Hank was checking bolts along the track when he looked up and froze. "Morning," Keanu said, casually, stepping out of the truck. Dust clung to his jeans, his sleeves rolled up. "Didn't think I'd find you guys this early." Hank blinked in surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, breaking into a grin. "You actually came back." Luis dropped his wrench and ran up. You really came back," he said, almost laughing in disbelief. "Why?" Keanu smiled. "I wanted to finish our conversation. You all disappeared before I got to ask how the week was going." The crew gathered around, still stunned. Gus chuckled, shaking his head. "You didn't have to come all this way for us." "Maybe not," Keanu said, "but I wanted to." He walked to the back of the truck and opened the tailgate. Inside were 2 large coolers. "I brought lunch. Figured you guys might appreciate something cold today." Luis's eyes went wide. "You brought all this?" "Yeah," Keanu said. "Sandwiches, lemonade, and a few surprises." Hank laughed, wiping his brow with a rag. "You're full of surprises, man. We thought Hollywood forgot about us already." Keanu leaned against the truck, smiling. "Not a chance. I've been thinking about you guys all week." When the lunch break came, they sat together again under the same rusty shelter. This time, the air felt lighter, almost joyful. Keanu handed out sandwiches and bottles one by one, insisting everyone eat before he did. They talked about the news, about the photo that had gone viral, about how strange it felt to be recognized in grocery stores. Gus joked, "I told my wife I'm famous now. She still made me take out the trash." Everyone laughed, even Keanu, shaking his head. "That sounds like a good woman," he said. As they ate, the crew realized that this wasn't a visit for publicity. It was something personal, a quiet return to gratitude. After lunch, Keanu stood and stretched, brushing dust from his jeans. The men assumed he was leaving, but instead, he grabbed a pair of gloves from the truck. Hank raised an eyebrow. "You planning on working too?" Keanu grinned. "If you'll have me." The crew laughed, half in disbelief. "You sure you can handle it?" Gus teased. "I'll do my best," Keanu said, slipping the gloves on, but no promises about speed. For the next few hours he worked alongside them, not pretending, not performing, just helping. He dragged old brush away from the tracks, lifted wooden planks, and held the steel bolts steady while Luis tightened them. Every so often, someone offered to take a photo, but he gently shook his head each time. "Let's just keep this one between us," he said. The men respected that. It made the moment feel sacred, untouched by the outside world. They worked in easy rhythm, the sounds of metal, gravel, and wind, mixing into a song of quiet unity. Hank glanced over at Keanu, who was sweating under the sun but smiling as if he belonged there. "You're gonna ruin your hands, man," he joked. Keanu looked at his palms, now streaked with rust and dirt. "Maybe they needed a reminder," he said. By mid-afternoon, the sky began to shift to a softer blue. The crew took another short break, sitting on the rails, passing around lemonade bottles. Luis sat beside Keanu, watching him carefully. "I still can't believe you came back," he said. "Most people would have moved on by now." Keanu nodded slowly. "I think sometimes, when something good happens, you have to go back to it, just to remember what it felt like to be grounded." Luis smiled. "You mean like us?" "Exactly like you," Keanu said. Hank joined in, taking a long drink. "You know, we've had big names visit the railroad before. Politicians, inspectors, company executives. But they all stood there with clipboards, talking numbers. You're the only one who actually sat down with us." Keanu met his gaze and smiled. "That's because I didn't come here to talk business. I came here to listen." The words landed heavier than he intended, quieting the group for a moment. Then Gus chuckled. "Well, if you ever get tired of acting, there's always a job here for you," Keanu laughed. "I'll keep that in mind." As the sun lowered behind the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange, he finally stood. "I should get going," he said softly. Hank shook his hand again, firm and grateful. "You've got a good heart, Keanu. Don't ever lose it." "I'll try not to," Keanu said, smiling. As he walked back to the truck, Luis quietly lifted his phone and took a picture, just one. It showed Keanu walking away, the light behind him, his shadow stretching across the rails. No cameras, no crowd, just a man leaving quietly after keeping his promise. Luis didn't post it. He just saved it, a memory of a moment when kindness felt as solid and lasting as the tracks beneath their feet. 2 days after Keanu's quiet visit, a local news van pulled into the dusty rail yard. The bright logo on the side of the van caught the crew's attention, and within minutes, a reporter and cameraman stepped out, shielding their eyes from the glare. Hank groaned softly. "Here we go again," he muttered. Gus elbowed him lightly. "Come on, boss. Maybe they're just here to thank us for keeping the trains running." The reporter smiled as she approached, holding a microphone. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. We're here to talk about your unexpected visitor last week. I understand he came back?" Hank squinted under his cap. "Yeah, he did. Quiet as the sunrise. No cameras, no reporters, just showed up with lunch and a few new tools." The reporter's eyes widened. "Really? He brought tools?" Hank nodded. "Said he wanted to help, and he did. Man can swing a hammer better than most of us expected." The crew chuckled. remembering how Keanu had carried planks and cleared brush without hesitation. Gus leaned closer to the microphone, grinning. We've had inspectors visit, company execs too, but never someone like him. He didn't tell us what to do, he just worked. The reporter smiled. What'd he talk about while he was here? He asked about our kids mostly, Hank said. About schools, about wages. Wanted to know how things really were for us. Not like a celebrity trying to sound smart, but like someone who cared about the answer. Luis, standing a few steps back, hesitated before stepping forward. He told me something that stuck, he said quietly. He said I shouldn't sell myself short. That building things is a kind of art. I've been thinking about that ever since. The reporter tilted her head. What do you mean? Louise took a deep breath. I used to want to study engineering. Dropped out after my dad died. But after talking to him, I signed up for night school again. I'm starting next month. The entire crew turned toward him, surprised. Hank's eyes softened. No kidding? That's something, son. Louise smiled, embarrassed. Guess it's never too late. The reporter lowered her microphone slightly. That's an incredible story. Gus clapped Luis on the shoulder. You'll make one hell of an engineer. The crew began joking among themselves again, laughing about how Keanu probably bruised his hands that day, or how they should have made him an honorary foreman. But beneath the humor was something deeper, renewed pride. For the first time in years, they felt that their work mattered beyond the rails they built. Someone had made them believe that again. By the time the segment aired that night, their words had spread far beyond Kansas. People across the country watched their interview and saw something honest men proud of what they did and grateful to have been seen. The news segment ran that evening across regional networks, but it didn't stay local for long. Within hours, clips began circulating online. Luis's line, "Building things is a kind of art," was replayed endlessly. It struck a chord with millions. People shared the video with comments like, "He's right, this is what pride in work sounds like," and, finally, someone's giving blue-collar workers the respect they deserve. By midnight, the interview had been viewed more than 5 million times. The comments poured in from all corners of the country: teachers, welders, truckers, janitors, and nurses, people who knew exactly what it felt like to be unseen. And then, something remarkable happened. A new hashtag began to trend, #Eat with the Workers. It started with a single post from a high school principal in Ohio. She uploaded a picture of herself having lunch with her school's custodial staff, writing, "They keep our halls clean and our classrooms running. Today, we shared sandwiches and stories." Inspired by Keanu Reeves and the railroad crew. By morning, churches, schools, and small businesses joined in. Pastors sat beside landscapers. Restaurant owners ate with dishwashers. Office managers joined delivery drivers in parking lots, sharing coffee and conversation. A factory supervisor in Detroit wrote, "We talk about teamwork, but never sit with the people who make the wheels turn. Today, we did. Thank you, Keanu, for reminding us who keeps this country moving." Even CEOs began participating. One photo showed a construction company owner sitting cross-legged on a concrete slab, lunching with his crew. The caption reading, "Respect doesn't wear suits." The movement spread like wildfire, reaching neighborhoods, workplaces, and schools across America. People began printing signs that read "Eat with the Workers" and hanging them in cafeterias, lunchrooms, and public parks. Back in Kansas, Hank and his crew couldn't believe what was happening. Reporters called again, not to ask about Keanu this time, but to ask about them. How does it feel to have started a movement? One journalist asked. Hank laughed. "We didn't start anything," he said. "He did. We just had lunch." Gus grinned beside him. "But we'll take credit if it keeps people being kind." Luis, now carrying a worn notebook filled with class notes from his new engineering course, looked humbled by the attention. "It's weird," he admitted. "We just did what people should do every day: sit together, talk, be human. But if it's reminding people that every job has value, then that's worth something." A week later, the railroad union officially released a statement embracing the movement. It read, "The tracks of America were built by men and women who believed in hard work and community. Eat with the Workers reminds us that respect travels both ways. The statement went viral. Major publications covered the phenomenon, describing it as a rare cultural moment where humility, not outrage, brought people together. Editorials called it the lunch heard around the world. Meanwhile, Keanu remained silent, just as he had since the photo first went viral. But those who knew him weren't surprised. He didn't need to say a word. His absence from the spotlight made the story feel even more genuine. In Kansas, the crew went back to work as usual. The days were the same: heat, dust, and the steady rhythm of metal meeting metal. But the way they carried themselves had changed. There was a new pride in their movements, a quiet dignity in every swing of the hammer. One afternoon, as they sat under the same old shelter eating lunch, Hank looked around the table and said, "Feels different now, doesn't it?" Gus nodded. "Yeah, the world's watching, and for once, it's watching for the right reasons." Louis smiled faintly, glancing at the tracks stretching into the distance. "It's funny," he said. "All this started with one man sitting down." The men nodded quietly, knowing he was right. Sometimes change doesn't begin with speeches or protests. It begins with a simple act of humanity that reminds everyone what respect looks like. And as freight trains roared past in the distance, carrying their weight across the country, the men went back to work heads high, hearts lighter, and hands steady, knowing they'd helped set something extraordinary in motion. Within a week, the movement was impossible to ignore. The photo of Keanu and the railroad crew had become an icon, now printed on posters, billboards, and magazine covers. It had shifted from a moment of curiosity to a symbol of dignity in work. While the world celebrated, the company that owned the railroad line stayed oddly quiet until the pressure became too much to ignore. One Monday morning, the train company released an official statement on their website. It featured glossy images of workers smiling beside clean locomotives and a bold headline that read, "Celebrating Unity and Teamwork Across America's Railways." The statement praised the spirit of connection and equality that defines our workforce. It mentioned the viral photo and even included a passing thank you to Keanu Reeves for highlighting the value of America's infrastructure heroes. But it never mentioned the long hours, the lack of benefits, or the safety concerns the crew had spoken about off camera. It was polished, distant, and empty. Hank read the statement on his phone during lunch break and sighed. "They didn't get it," he muttered. Louise frowned, leaning over to look. "What do you mean?" "They're talking like it's some kind of PR campaign," Hank said. "We weren't looking for headlines. We just wanted people to understand what we go through." Gus snorted. "Figures. They love the attention, but not the truth." Within hours, journalists picked up on the same thing. Articles began to appear with headlines like, "Rail Company Praises Photo, Ignores Reality," and "Workers Speak Out on Conditions Behind Viral Moment." Reporters uncovered documents showing that many employees hadn't received a wage adjustment in over 4 years, and that overtime policies were quietly cutting into rest time. Public reaction shifted fast. What had begun as admiration turned into outrage, not at Keanu or the workers, but at the system that profited from their silence. Talk shows replayed the image of Keanu in the dirt beside the workers, juxtaposed against corporate boardrooms and company executives. One commentator said, "That photo isn't just about kindness, it's about contrast. Look at who gets respect in this country, and who earns it." Another added, "He didn't mean to start a movement, but he reminded us how disconnected we've become from the people who keep our world running." Meanwhile, Keanu stayed out of sight. He didn't give interviews or issue statements. Instead, he quietly made a call to a friend in Los Angeles who managed several nonprofit accounts. Within 48 hours, a large anonymous donation appeared in the ledger of the Workers' Safety Fund, a program that supported injured or underpaid laborers across the country. The donor's name was listed only as John Winter. Luis would later learn from a reporter that the donation came from someone connected to the story. But Keanu never confirmed it. When asked about it months later, he simply smiled and said, "Some things don't need names." As the public outcry grew, the company's executives scrambled to manage the narrative. They scheduled interviews on business networks, speaking in calm, measured tones about employee appreciation and corporate transparency. One vice president smiled stiffly as she told a reporter, "We've always valued our workers. That's why we're proud of how this moment has highlighted the teamwork that defines our organization." But the public wasn't buying it. Underneath the polished words, viewers saw evasion. On social media, people flooded the company's pages with angry comments. One user wrote, "You value your workers? Then pay them fairly." Another added, "You don't get to ride on someone else's humility." Talk shows replayed the viral image, pairing it with headlines about labor rights and pay disparities. It wasn't about Keanu anymore, it was about what the photo represented. The same shot that once inspired quiet admiration had now become a rallying cry. Meanwhile, Hank, Luis, and Gus kept showing up for work. They hadn't asked for fame, and they didn't know how to handle the flood of attention that still followed them. Every day, new letters arrived at the small station office. Some were handwritten, others typed neatly with return addresses from across the country. The envelopes carried stories of admiration and gratitude. Hank opened one from Pennsylvania. It read, "My father worked the rails for 40 years. Seeing that picture made me cry. Thank you for reminding us that honest work still matters." Another, addressed to Luis, came from a high school teacher in Oregon. "I showed my students your interview. They were moved by what you said about going back to school. You gave them hope." Luis sat at the break table that afternoon, reading the letters one by one. "People really care," he said softly. "All because of one lunch." Hank smiled, leaning back. Maybe people were waiting for something real to believe in again. Even Gus, who rarely spoke about emotions, nodded thoughtfully. "It's strange, isn't it? We've been doing this job our whole lives, and it took one picture for anyone to notice." Luis folded one of the letters carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "Guess we were invisible until someone decided to sit down with us." Elsewhere, journalists kept uncovering uncomfortable truths. Investigations revealed that workplace injuries along certain railway routes were being underreported. Former employees came forward describing 12-hour shifts and limited breaks. Each revelation added fuel to the growing conversation about labor dignity. Keanu watched it all unfold from afar. He avoided interviews and stayed away from public events, but his quiet presence lingered everywhere in the conversation. Every network still showed his image alongside the men he had shared lunch with, and every article about corporate neglect ended with a reference to his name. Rachel called one evening, exasperated. "You know, if you just made a statement, you could control this story," she said. Keanu's voice was calm. "The story's not mine anymore. It belongs to them." Rachel sighed, realizing he meant it. "Then at least tell me why the alias, John Winter? No one knows it's you who donated to the fund." Keanu smiled faintly. "Because the point isn't who gives, it's that giving happens." That same week, the Workers' Safety Fund announced a new scholarship program for trade school students in underprivileged areas. The press release mentioned an anonymous benefactor who had funded the initiative entirely. No one doubted who it was, even if he never admitted it. Back in Kansas, the crew gathered at the yard one evening as the sun dipped behind the horizon. They were tired but proud, sitting in the same spot where the story had begun. Hank took one last sip of coffee and said, "You know, maybe change doesn't start in boardrooms after all." Luis looked out at the rails gleaming in the fading light. "No," he said quietly. "It starts wherever someone decides to care." The others nodded in silence, watching the last train of the day thunder past, sparks flying from the tracks like stars. And somewhere far away, Keanu Reeves alone, at peace and content, smiled to himself, knowing that a single act of kindness had set something greater in motion than anyone could have planned. Months passed, but the image of Keanu sitting beside the railroad workers refused to fade from the public's mind. It had become something larger, a symbol of humility and respect that sparked an entire conversation across America. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a movement. One morning, while Keanu was on location for a small independent film in Oregon, his assistant, Rachel, walked into his trailer holding a sleek folder and an excited smile. "You need to see this," she said. Inside was a proposal from acclaimed documentary filmmaker David Lasker, known for his raw, human-centered films about working-class America. The letter was simple but passionate. "Your act of kindness reminded the world of the dignity in labor. I want to make a documentary called Tracks of Honor, a film that gives voice to the people who build this country. I believe you can help tell that story the right way." Rachel looked at him expectantly. "They want you to narrate it, produce it, and be the face of it." Keanu read the letter again, quietly. He set it down, thoughtful. "If I do this, it has to be their story, not mine," he said finally. "The workers should be the ones telling it." Rachel tilted her head. "You mean Hank and his crew?" "And everyone like them," Keanu said. "The people who keep the lights on, the rails running, the cities moving but never get seen." She smiled softly. He realized this could be powerful. He nodded. "Only if it's honest." A week later, Keanu met with David Lasker in Los Angeles. The filmmaker, a silver-haired man with weathered eyes, greeted him warmly. "You've already done half my job," he said. "You made people care." "I didn't make them care," Keanu replied. "They just needed a reminder." They sat for hours, mapping out the vision for the film. It wouldn't be a glossy celebrity project. There would be no stage shots, no dramatic music. It would be real handheld cameras, authentic voices, and the sound of machinery in the background. Lasker leaned forward, pen tapping against his notebook. "You're serious about letting the workers narrate this?" "Completely," Keanu said. "If their voices aren't at the center, then the film misses the point." When the deal was finalized, Keanu made one request. The first interviews had to begin back in Kansas, where everything started. Lasker agreed. A month later, a small film crew arrived at the same dusty rail yard where Keanu had first met Hank and Luis. The men stood beside the tracks again, surprised but smiling, as cameras were set up under the same fading shelter. Hank laughed. "You sure you want to film us? We ain't exactly movie material," Keanu grinned. "That's what makes you perfect." As the camera rolled for the first time, the sound of a distant train thundered through the background just as it had months before. And so began Tracks of Honor, a story not of fame, but of the forgotten hands that built the country. Filming began under the open sky, the camera capturing the hum of engines, the crunch of gravel, and the rhythm of metal striking metal. It wasn't glamorous. It was honest. Hank spoke first, his deep voice steady but emotional. 30 years I've worked these rails, missed birthdays, holidays, all of it. Never thought anyone would care about what we do out here. But that day, when he sat down with us, it reminded me that we matter." Luis followed, his eyes reflecting both pride and youth. "I used to think this job was just about fixing things. But it's more than that. Every train that passes carries someone's story. And we're the ones making sure it gets where it needs to go." Keanu stood behind the camera, listening quietly, letting their words carry the power of truth. He didn't interrupt or coach. He just nodded, giving them the space to speak. Over the next several weeks, filming took the crew across America. They visited oil rigs in Texas, shipyards in Louisiana, and construction sites in Detroit. Everywhere they went, the workers spoke from the heart. A single mother welding in a steel factory said, "People look at these hands and see dirt, but I see strength. This is what feeds my kids." A retired coal miner in West Virginia said, "We built the foundations, but somehow people forgot we exist." Maybe this film will remind them. Each story layered on another, building something raw and deeply human. When the team reviewed the early footage, there were no flashy cuts or grand speeches, just faces lit by the glow of work lamps, telling their truths. David Lasker turned to Keanu one evening in the editing room. "You know, most documentaries have a narrator guiding the story," he said. "But this one doesn't need it. Their voices do all the work." Keanu nodded. "That's exactly what I hoped for." The production lasted 3 months. Every location brought new faces and new stories. Farmers, mechanics, bridge painters, janitors. They laughed, they cried, and they spoke of the quiet pride that came with hard work. By the time filming wrapped, the footage filled dozens of hard drives. David turned to Keanu as they stood by the final shoot location, the sun dipping low over the horizon. "This isn't your movie," he said. "It's theirs, but you gave it a heartbeat." Keanu looked out across the tracks, now glowing gold in the evening light. "No," he said softly. "They did that on their own. I just showed up." When Tracks of Honor premiered months later at a small film festival in Colorado, there were no red carpets, no tuxedos, no staged publicity. The workers from Kansas sat in the front row wearing their best shirts and work boots. As the credits rolled, the audience rose to their feet in silence, then applause erupted, raw and heartfelt. The film didn't just move people, it awakened something. In that darkened theater, beneath the glow of the screen, the soul of working America had finally found its voice. Months later, Tracks of Honor had grown from a small, independent project into a cultural phenomenon. It was screened in schools, community centers, and union halls across America. People who had never set foot on a rail yard were moved to tears by the stories of men and women who kept the country moving. The documentary wasn't about celebrity or glamour. It was about the quiet dignity of labor. One cold February evening, Keanu received a call from David Lasker. "We did it," the filmmaker said, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Tracks of Honor just won the National Film Guild's award for Best Humanitarian Documentary." Keanu sat in silence for a moment, then smiled softly. "That's not my win," he said. "That belongs to them." Still, David insisted he attend the ceremony. "You have to be there. You helped make this possible." A week later, the awards night arrived in Los Angeles. The ballroom glittered with spotlights and designer suits, but Keanu's presence stood out for its simplicity. He arrived quietly, wearing a plain black suit and no entourage. Cameras flashed as he entered, but his expression stayed calm, humble. Reporters shouted questions as he walked down the carpet. "Keanu, how does it feel to be nominated?" one asked. He smiled. "It feels good to see real people's stories being celebrated," he said. "That's all that matters." Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. Rows of filmmakers, actors, and industry veterans filled the room. When the category for Best Humanitarian Documentary was announced, David leaned over to Keanu and whispered, "No matter what happens, this film already changed lives." The presenter opened the envelope with a grin. "And the award goes to Tracks of Honor." The audience erupted in applause. David clapped Keanu on the back, motioning for him to stand. But Keanu shook his head. "Not just me," he said. "They're here too." He turned toward the side of the hall where Hank Morales and Luis sat nervously in borrowed suits. Both men looked stunned. Keanu gestured for them to join him, and the crowd parted as the two railroad workers walked to the stage, still trying to believe it was real. When they reached the podium, the lights were bright and blinding. Luis's hands trembled as he held the trophy. Hank, standing beside him, cleared his throat and adjusted the microphone. The room fell silent. He looked out at the crowd directors, actors, executives, and then down at the award in his hand. "We fix tracks so others can travel safely," he began, his voice steady. "Tonight, someone finally saw us." The room erupted in applause. It wasn't polite or rehearsed, it was thunderous and raw. The kind of applause that carried gratitude and awe. Cameras zoomed in on Keanu, who stood slightly behind them, smiling quietly with pride. His eyes glistened, but he didn't step forward. He wanted the moment to belong entirely to them. For once, the spotlight found its rightful place. The applause continued until the presenter finally motioned for quiet. But even then, the room buzzed with emotion. Hank stepped back, his hand still gripping the microphone, uncertain what to say next. Keanu gave him a small nod of encouragement. Luis hesitated, his voice barely audible at first. "I never thought I'd be standing here," he said softly. "I used to fix rails in the heat, wondering if what I did mattered. And then, someone sat down next to me and reminded me that it does." He paused, looking down at the shining award. "This isn't about fame or movies or awards. It's about every man and woman who gets up before sunrise to make sure the world keeps running. You all deserve to be seen." The audience rose again, unable to hold back their admiration. It wasn't just applause, now it was a standing ovation. Keanu stepped forward, only to place a hand on Luis's shoulder. "You did great," he whispered. Luis smiled, eyes wet with disbelief. Hank reached over and shook Keanu's hand tightly. "You brought us here," he said. Keanu shook his head. "No, Hank. You brought yourselves here." They stood together under the lights, 3 silhouettes against the golden glow of the stage. The camera zoomed in on Keanu's quiet smile, his face reflecting a mix of pride and humility. For once, he wasn't the star, he was part of something bigger, something human and enduring. Later that evening, as the guests mingled and champagne glasses clinked, Keanu slipped out of the ballroom and onto the terrace overlooking the city. The night air was cool, and the distant sound of traffic hummed like the rhythm of a passing train. Hank and Luis soon joined him, their suits slightly wrinkled but their smiles genuine. Hank leaned on the railing, gazing out over the city lights. "Never thought I'd be standing in a place like this," he said quietly. Keanu laughed softly. "You've earned it. Tonight wasn't about where you come from, it was about who you are." Luis nodded, his voice steady now. "Feels like the whole world finally listened." Keanu looked out at the horizon, thoughtful. "Maybe. But what matters most is that you keep believing in what you do. That's how real change sticks." They stood there for a while in comfortable silence, watching the city pulse with life below them. It felt almost poetic, 3 men from different worlds, connected by one simple truth: respect is built, not given. Inside, people were still talking about Tracks of Honor, praising its honesty and power. But out on that terrace, away from the lights and noise, the 3 men shared something quieter: gratitude. When they finally parted, Keanu clasped Hank's shoulder once more. "Thank you," he said. Hank frowned slightly. "For what?" "For reminding me what decency looks like," Keanu replied. Luis smiled, faintly. "Guess we all reminded each other." As they walked away into the night, the city lights shimmered like sparks on steel. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the hills, steady, proud, and unbroken. It was the sound of movement, the sound of work, the sound of everything they had built together. A few quiet weeks passed after the awards ceremony. The noise of the media had finally softened, and Keanu returned to his quiet routines. He was back home in the hills outside Los Angeles, where the days were still and the nights carried the cool scent of pine and ocean air. The whirlwind of attention around Tracks of Honor had begun to fade, but its impact lingered in ways he couldn't yet see. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the curtains, Rachel arrived with a stack of mail. Most of it was fan letters and charity requests, but one envelope stood out. It was plain, handwritten, and slightly wrinkled from travel. The return address was from Kansas. Keanu opened it slowly. Inside was a small folded letter written in neat, looping handwriting. The first line stopped him cold. "Dear Mr. Reeves, you don't know me, but my name is Sophia Morales. I'm Gus's daughter, the one who dreamed of being a teacher." He read on, his eyes tracing each word carefully. "When my dad told me you came to eat with them, I didn't believe him at first. I thought maybe he was joking. Then, I saw the photo and the documentary. I saw the way he looked at himself again, not like a man just fixing tracks, but like someone who mattered. I wanted to thank you for that." The next paragraph brought a lump to his throat. "Because of you, people found my old GoFundMe page. Donations came in from strangers all over the country, teachers, parents, even other workers. They said your kindness reminded them what community looks like. And now I can finally say it. I start college next week." Keanu set the letter down for a moment, staring out the window. The sound of birds filled the still morning. He smiled quietly, shaking his head as if trying to absorb it all. He picked up the letter again. "I wanted to tell you this, not because of the money, but because of what you gave my dad. He used to come home tired and quiet, like the world forgot about him. But after that day, he came home proud. He said someone sat in the dirt and made him feel human again. You gave him back his dignity, and that changed both of us. Her final lines were simple, but they lingered in his heart. Thank you for sitting down that day. Thank you for reminding my father that what he does matters, and for reminding me that dreams don't die, they just wait for a reason to live again. The letter ended with a small drawing, a pair of train tracks leading toward a sunrise. Beneath it, she had written, "From Sophia and Dad." Keanu folded the letter carefully, his expression soft and thoughtful. He realized then that the smallest actions, the ones that seemed ordinary in the moment, had the power to travel farther than anyone could imagine. That evening, Keanu sat on his porch as the last light of day faded behind the hills. The air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that makes reflection easy. He held Sophia's letter in his hands, the paper slightly creased from being read over and over. Her words had done something he didn't expect. They reminded him why that moment on the railway had mattered in the first place. He reached for his leather-bound journal, the one he carried everywhere. Inside were notes from film sets, personal reflections, and fragments of thoughts he rarely shared. He unfolded Sophia's letter once more, then carefully tucked it into one of the blank pages. Beneath it, he wrote slowly in ink, "Small moments make big ripples." He paused for a long time, staring at the phrase. Then he underlined the word "small," because that's what it had been: just lunch, just conversation, just respect. Yet somehow it had become a spark that traveled across the country, igniting hope where there had once been indifference. As the sky darkened, Keanu leaned back and looked up at the stars. They scattered across the night in quiet brilliance, thousands of lights shining alone yet connected just like people, he thought. Maybe that was the truth of it all. Small connections, holding a vast world together. His phone buzzed beside him. It was a message from Hank. The photo was blurry but full of life. Luis, Gus, and a few of the crew were gathered around a table at a diner, laughing over pie. The caption read, "Still keeping the rails running, brother. Come back anytime." Keanu smiled, typing a short reply. "Tell them the next round of coffee's on me." He set the phone aside and let the night settle in around him. The cicadas hummed softly in the distance, blending with the faint echo of a train whistle far off in the valley. The sound carried him back to that first day, the heat, the laughter, the taste of a simple sandwich shared among strangers who became friends. Somewhere in Kansas, a young woman was packing for her first day of college. Somewhere else, a man who'd worked the rails his entire life was telling his coworkers that their stories were worth something. And somewhere online, people were still using the hashtag number #EatWithTheWorkers, turning one humble act into a movement of compassion. Keanu exhaled deeply, a quiet smile lingering on his face. He didn't need headlines or awards. What mattered was this: the proof that kindness, when done without expectation, could ripple outward and touch lives he'd never even meet. He closed his journal gently and whispered to the night, "Thank you." Above him, the stars seemed to shimmer brighter, as if echoing the sentiment. He sat there a little longer, the sound of the distant train fading into the horizon, and felt a deep peace. One small meal, one act of listening, had changed countless lives, and, in its own quiet way, it had changed his too. In the weeks that followed, the story of Keanu and the railroad crew continued to travel far beyond anyone's expectations. Across America's small towns, break rooms, garages, and train stations began displaying the same photo, the one that had started everything. It showed Keanu, sitting cross-legged in the dirt beside Hank, Luis, Gus, and the others, laughing over a simple lunch. It wasn't glamorous or staged, but that was what made it powerful. In a repair shop in Ohio, a mechanic had pinned the photo above the tool bench with a handwritten note, "Respect every pair of hands that works." In a diner in Mississippi, the same image hung near the counter, next to a sign that read, "We serve everyone." A teacher in Oklahoma showed the photo to her class before a lesson about kindness and said, "This is what humility looks like." The movement that had begun online had found its way into the physical world. It wasn't just a story anymore. It had become a symbol A local TV station in Nebraska aired a short feature titled "The Picture That Changed America's View of Work." The camera panned across small-town workers, welders, janitors, farmers, bus drivers, all standing beside printouts of that same photo. One retired railroad worker, his cap frayed and his hands trembling slightly, looked directly into the lens. "He made us proud to be who we are," the old man said. "Most people look at us and just see the dirt on our clothes." He saw the people underneath. The reporter nodded, visibly moved. "What do you think the picture means to you?" The old man smiled faintly. "That it's not about fame or money. It's about decency, something this country needs to remember." That quote aired nationwide and struck a chord. Even some of the early critics who had mocked Keanu's actions began to soften. Talk show hosts who once joked about red carpets and rail dust now praised the sincerity of his silence. One said on air, "It takes strength to do something good and never brag about it." Meanwhile, the hashtag number Eat With The Workers began trending again, not as a fad, but as a quiet reminder. People shared stories of eating lunch with janitors, bus drivers, or cleaning crews. Each story ended the same way with gratitude. In Kansas, Hank and Luis noticed that visitors were now stopping by the rail yard to drop off notes, snacks, and even framed copies of the famous photo. Hank laughed about it at first, saying, "Guess we're part of history now." But when he saw a young kid pointing at the picture and saying, "That's my hero," he grew quiet. He turned to Luis and said softly, "You know, maybe that day wasn't just about us. Maybe it was about everyone who's ever been overlooked." Luis nodded, and he showed them what it means to look closer. Neither of them knew it yet, but the story was about to find one more voice, the woman who had first spoken up on that train. In a quiet suburban home just outside Chicago, Emily Carter was folding laundry when she saw a familiar image flash across her television screen. The segment was about the success of Tracks of Honor, the documentary she had followed from afar. The anchor spoke about its humanitarian impact, about how one small moment of compassion had changed the way people saw one another. Emily set the laundry basket aside and sat down on the couch. She hadn't expected to feel such emotion after all this time. On the screen, she saw footage of Keanu smiling humbly as he stood beside the workers on stage at the award ceremony. Then came an interview clip with Hank, talking about how he didn't talk down to us, he talked with us. Her son, now 8, walked in holding a snack. "Mom, that's him," he said excitedly, pointing at the television. "That's the guy from the train." Emily smiled softly. "Yeah, it is. Remember that day?" He nodded, his eyes bright. "You said he was being human." She nodded again, touched that he remembered. And he still is. A few days later, Emily received a letter in the mail from the film's production company. Inside was a formal invitation, embossed with gold lettering. It read, "You are cordially invited to attend the national premiere, Tracks of Honor, in recognition of your kindness and integrity that day on the train." Emily stared at the letter for a long moment, then laughed softly. "Guess the world really is small," she said. When the night of the premiere arrived, she wore a simple navy blue dress, nothing fancy, just something comfortable. She arrived with her son at a modest theater in downtown Chicago. Flashing lights and camera crews filled the entrance, but when Keanu saw her in the crowd, his expression changed instantly from formal calm to pure warmth. He stepped away from the reporters and approached her. "Emily," he said with a smile, "you're here." She laughed nervously. "I wasn't sure you'd even remember me." "How could I forget?" he said. "You were the first person who stood up that day. You saw what mattered before anyone else did." Her son tugged on Keanu's sleeve shyly. "Thank you for being nice to the workers," he said. Keanu knelt slightly, smiling at the boy. "They were nice to me first." Inside the theater, as the lights dimmed and the opening scene of Tracks of Honor filled the screen, Emily felt tears rise. The same image appeared once more, the photo of Keanu sitting with the men, laughing under the harsh Sunday. But now, it meant even more. It wasn't just a moment frozen in time. It was a symbol that had outlived its circumstances, carrying hope into places it had never been before. After the screening, reporters gathered around Emily, asking what she thought of it all. She answered simply, her voice calm but firm. That day, he didn't act like a celebrity. He acted like a human being. And that's what the world needed to see. The word spread across headlines the next morning, quoted by newspapers, and shared online. And as dawn broke over the nation, the photo of that lunch on the tracks continued to hang in break rooms, garages, and classrooms. A silent reminder that dignity doesn't depend on wealth or fame, but on the courage to treat others as equals. A full year had passed since the day Keanu first sat in the dirt beside the railroad workers, but the memory of that moment had only grown stronger with time. The photograph still hung in countless places, framed in diners, taped to workshop walls, printed in textbooks about modern kindness. What had once been a simple act had become a quiet symbol that outlasted news cycles and online trends. In Kansas, spring sunlight fell across the familiar stretch of tracks where it had all begun. The rail yard looked much the same: rusted equipment, the smell of oil and earth, but one thing had changed. A large mural now covered the side of a nearby brick building. It showed Keanu and the crew sitting together in the sand, sharing lunch beneath the heat of the Sunday. The scene was painted in warm tones of gold and amber, the faces captured with care and reverence. Local artists had created it as a gift to the workers of the town, calling it the Table Without Walls. Beneath it, in simple black lettering, were the words, "For all who labor unseen." The mural became a gathering point for people across the state. Workers came during lunch breaks, families stopped by on road trips, and students took photos beside it for their school projects. But one morning, long before the crowds arrived, a familiar figure appeared alone. Keanu stepped quietly onto the gravel, his hands in his pockets. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet grass and steel. He stood before the mural, gazing at it for a long time. His reflection shimmered faintly in the gloss of the paint, and for a moment, it was as if the man in the artwork looked back at him. He knelt down and placed a single yellow flower at the base of the wall. The petals trembled slightly in the breeze. "For all who work unseen," he whispered, repeating the words beneath the mural. His voice was soft, almost reverent. He stayed there for a few quiet minutes before stepping back, his eyes tracing each painted face: Hank's easy grin, Gus's focused stare, Luis's youthful smile. They looked as alive as they had that first day. Later that morning, a local resident who passed by the mural recognized him but said nothing. She simply watched as he stood there in silence, then turned and walked away down the track path, the early sunlight stretching long shadows behind him. That afternoon, he didn't return to a film set or a studio. Instead, he drove to a nearby community center that was hosting a food drive for laid-off workers. He arrived without announcement, wearing jeans and a plain shirt, and spent the day helping pack boxes and load them into cars. The volunteers didn't treat him like a celebrity. They treated him like one of them. And that, to Keanu, was the highest honor possible. That same week, stories about Keanu's quiet visit began to surface. Local papers reported that he had come alone at dawn to see the mural and had spent the rest of the day volunteering at the Wichita Community Food Drive. Photos showed him handing out boxes of canned goods and shaking hands with workers who had lost their jobs during a factory shutdown. There were no speeches, no interviews, just simple gestures, the same as before. When reporters later asked the food bank director why he hadn't announced Keanu's visit beforehand, she smiled. "He told us he didn't want cameras. He said helping people only counts when it's not for show." Back in Kansas, Hank Morales had officially retired. His story had been featured in American Labor Weekly, alongside a photo of him standing proudly beneath the mural. The caption read, "30 years of service, one unforgettable lunch." He kept the framed article in his living room, right beside an old clock that hadn't worked in years but that he refused to throw away. Luis, meanwhile, had completed his engineering program. On graduation day, his classmates cheered when his name was called. As he walked across the stage, he thought about the moment that had changed everything the day Keanu told him that building things was a kind of art. His mother, Rosa, sat in the audience with tears in her eyes, holding a small American flag in one hand and a worn lunchbox in the other. After the ceremony, Luis stood outside with his diploma, looking up at the sky. "We did it, Dad," he whispered quietly. A few days later, he received a package with no return address. Inside was a sleek silver pen and a note that read, "Keep building. The world needs more hands like yours." It wasn't signed, but he didn't need to guess who it was from. Back in Los Angeles, Keanu sat on his balcony that evening with a cup of tea, the faint hum of the city below. The letters and photos from Kansas had become part of his quiet ritual. Sometimes he reread them. Other times he simply looked at the mural photo and smiled. Rachel stepped outside, joining him. "You know that mural's been declared a historical landmark?" she said. "They're calling it a tribute to American labor." Keanu smiled faintly. "It's not a tribute to me." "I know," she said gently. "But it wouldn't exist without you." He took a slow sip of tea, the night air cool against his skin. "All I did was sit down," he said softly. "They did the rest." The city lights shimmered below them, a reflection of 1,000 lives working, striving, unseen. Somewhere out there, trains still rolled across the plains, their whistles echoing into the open sky. And in a small Kansas town, a mural stood tall against the rising dawn, a reminder that compassion doesn't need fame, and that one quiet act can carry farther than anyone could ever measure. For Keanu, it was never about recognition, it was about remembrance. And as the night deepened, he whispered to himself with quiet conviction, "Here's to the ones who keep the world turning." The screen fades from the quiet image of the Kansas mural into a slow-moving montage of real faces: railroad workers, janitors, nurses, factory employees, and bus drivers. Each one captured in their element. The narrator's voice enters gently, steady, and reflective. Keanu didn't post that photo. The world did. Because sometimes, kindness speaks louder than fame. The film shows Hank walking beside the tracks, now retired, his steps slow but sure. A caption appears briefly, 30 years of service, still checking the rails out of habit. Then, the image shifts to Luis, standing proudly at a drafting table in a small engineering office. He traces blueprints with steady hands, a faint smile on his face. His diploma hangs on the wall behind him. The narrator continues, "For some, dignity isn't about status or wealth. It's about the pride of doing what needs to be done, even when no one is watching." Next, the footage transitions to a series of small towns across America. In break rooms and union halls, the famous photo of Keanu and the crew still hangs in frames. Workers pass by it every day, sometimes pausing for a moment before returning to their shifts. The camera lingers on a mechanic wiping his hands on a rag before tapping the edge of the frame and whispering, "Thanks, man." In Chicago, Emily Carter appears briefly, walking her son to school. She carries his lunch bag while he skips ahead, waving to the crossing guard. A news reporter's voice plays softly in the background. The viral act of kindness that started on a Kansas railway continues to inspire ordinary people to see one another differently. The montage widens to show glimpses of people sharing meals together. Office workers eating beside, janitors, students sitting with cafeteria staff, and a group of bus drivers sharing sandwiches at a roadside stop. The narrator's voice returns. "Maybe we can't fix every system. Maybe we can't close every gap. But we can honor those who keep the world running." Images of the mural flash again, this time surrounded by best of lace, children sketching it in their notebooks. A teacher's voice is heard faintly saying, "Remember, the greatest heroes are often the quiet ones." The music swells softly as the film revisits Keanu's final visit to the mural. He's seen standing beneath it again at dawn, a single yellow flower in his hand. The sunlight paints his face in gold. The camera lingers for a few seconds as he places the flower beneath the wall and whispers, "For all who work unseen." Then, the scene fades into black. The words appear slowly on the screen. Kindness doesn't need to be noticed to matter. The music softens into a quiet instrumental melody as the black screen slowly fades into color again. The scene now shows a train gliding through the golden plains, its steady rhythm echoing like a heartbeat. The narrator's voice returns, warm and grounded. Every day, millions of hands keep the world moving. Some drive trains, some clean schools, some build bridges, some serve meals. Most will never be on camera. Most will never be thanked. The image changes to show a janitor mopping a hallway late at night, a nurse holding an elderly patient's hand, a bus driver waiting patiently for a late passenger. Each frame lingers just long enough to let the viewer feel the weight of their quiet devotion. The narrator continues, but dignity doesn't depend on who notices. It depends on how we show up for our work, for each other, for the world we share. The camera cuts back to the mural in Kansas, glowing in the warm light of sunset. Families gather there, taking pictures, pointing out faces. A father lifts his young daughter onto his shoulders and says softly, "Those men kept the train safe," and he reminded everyone to thank them. The little girl presses her hand against the painted rails, smiling. A montage follows Hank standing proudly beside his grandkids at a local fair. Louise, teaching a group of high school students about engineering. Gus's daughter, Sophia, writing on a chalkboard in her first classroom, her voice full of confidence as she says, "Work hard, stay kind. That's how we build a better world." Then, the frame shifts back to Keanu. He's seen volunteering again, sorting boxes at another food drive, smiling easily as he carries heavy loads with the others. No one treats him like a star. He blends into the crowd, laughing, moving, helping. The narrator's voice lowers slightly. He never wanted the story to be about him. He just wanted it to remind people what compassion looks like. A soft pause follows, and then the scene widens again. The camera glides across vast stretches of railroad track cutting through the heart of the country, steel and gravel stretching endlessly beneath open sky. "Maybe we can't fix every system," the narrator says. "Maybe we can't change every rule. But we can honor those who keep it running. The builders, the drivers, the cleaners, the quiet ones who hold everything together." The train passes a crossing where a worker in a safety vest waves to it as it thunders by. For a brief second, the camera captures his smile, proud and content. The screen begins to fade again as the narrator concludes, "Because in the end, greatness isn't about standing above others, it's about standing with them." The final image returns to the mural one last time. Morning light floods the scene, and beneath the words, "For all who labor unseen," the flower Keanu left has begun to wilt, but a few fresh ones lie beside it, left by others who followed his example. The music swells one final time, gentle but full of hope. Then, the narrator's final words arrive softly, as if spoken directly to the viewer. "Have you ever thanked someone whose work keeps your world moving?" A short pause. Then, the second prompt fades onto the screen. "What story would you like to see next with Keanu Reeves?" The screen turns black, the music fades, and the credits roll quietly, humbly, leaving behind the echo of rails, the warmth of sunlight, and the enduring reminder that dignity belongs to everyone.